I read 34 books in 2025, and not all of them were winners. Today, I am going to be counting down my top 10 favorite reads from this past year, as well as sharing a few that just didn't work for me. Let's dive right into it, shall we? Cue the intro. Before we get to the good stuff, I want to be honest about a few books that didn't quite work for me. As I mentioned in my last video, I only gave up on one book all year long, and that was Slow Gods by Claire North. I really wanted to love this one, I really did. There's genuinely a lot of really cool sci-fi world building here, and North's prose is sharp and confident. But early on, I hit an admittedly very specific wall: the neo-pronouns. Every time I ran into these, my brain just slammed on the brakes. Like this one. Is this pronounced qui? Is it key? How about this one? Is it quiz? Kiss? Quiz? Kiz? Is this one hey? Or is the accent mark just some visual signifier and not actually pronounced? And once I started thinking about all that, the immersion was gone. I even tried mentally just swapping everything to simply they, them. But then I was just thinking about that instead of the story. I only made it about 12% of the way through the book before finally admitting defeat. Now, when I posted these thoughts on Goodreads, a few people commented that my reaction was sort of transphobe coded, and I think that's a stretch. So I want to be really clear here. My issue is not at all with the idea of exploring gender or alien cultures or non-traditional understandings of identity. I have in the past really enjoyed that kind of speculative exploration. My issue here is purely with the execution. I found the prose level experience of reading this book so clunky that it just broke narrative flow. That's it. And we have plenty of examples showing this concept can be done elegantly. I mean, The Left Hand of Darkness is a masterclass in exploring gender through speculative biology and culture. Iain M. Banks's The Player of Games also handles alien gender structures in a way that feels immersive rather than obstructive. The problem for me isn't the concept at all. It's the craft decision on how it's rendered on the page. I'm sure there are plenty of readers for whom all this will be a feature and not a bug, but for me, it just never settled into a smooth reading experience. With all that said, I would still consider myself to be a fan of Claire North. The first 15 lives of Harry August is fantastic. And having heard so much about Touch, I fully intend to give it a try at some point in the not too distant future. So this isn't a breakup, so to speak. It's just a temporary mismatch. Next up in the ones I didn't care for category is my least favorite book I read this year, and that is Rhythm of War by Brandon Sanderson. I buddy read this one with a friend from church, and the way she summarized it was perfect. She said, "I just feel like this meeting could have been an email." And yeah, that's exactly the vibe. This is a series that, in my opinion, is starting to seriously overstay its welcome. And that's almost entirely because of this book. Rhythm of War does not earn its unbelievably bloated page count. There are a few genuinely great moments, flashes of the brilliance that made me love earlier Stormlight entries, but they arrive far too late and are buried under enormous stretches of repetition and wheel spinning and over-explaining. By the end, I wasn't angry, I was just tired. And I think that's a worse feeling for an epic fantasy series than outright disdain. I am taking a break from Stormlight for the foreseeable future, but I will probably continue on with it at some point. To borrow a poker term, I am pot committed by now, but this was the book where I really felt the strain for the first time, unfortunately. And finally, rounding out the ones I didn't care for, we have a classic, A Sacred Cow, a book I was fully prepared to enjoy, but just didn't enjoy at all. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. I read this aloud to my 5th graders at the end of last school year, and it starts out charming enough. A curious girl, a weird rabbit, a whimsical descent into nonsense. It's fun and very quirky, but very quickly the story feels like it's running in place. Scene after scene of arbitrary absurdity with no narrative momentum, no real emotional stakes, and no real sense of progression. What begins as playful becomes, for me, just exhausting. And then we arrive at the "it was all a dream" ending, possibly my least favorite trope in all of storytelling. It retroactively drains what little narrative weight the story had at all and leaves you with the sense that none of it really mattered. Now, I understand the historical importance. I understand the influence. I understand that for many readers, this book is foundational. But reading it aloud day after day with actual children, I found that Alice does not earn its untouchable status in the children's literature canon. And I wasn't alone. The other 5th grade teachers at my school felt pretty much the exact same way. So much so, in fact, that we have collectively decided not to teach Alice this year. Instead, we are closing out the school year with Holes by Louis Sachar, which, frankly, I think is a trade up in every conceivable way. Your mileage may vary here, I suppose, depending on your capacity for tolerating inconsequential nonsense. But for 2025, Alice firmly lands in the "didn't care for it" column, just above Rhythm of War. All right, now that we've gotten the grumbling out of the way, let's talk about the books I did love. Before we get to the official top 10, I want to highlight a few noteworthy runners up, and the first one I want to discuss is Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. If you somehow haven't read it yet, Station 11 follows a collection of interconnected characters before and after a global pandemic collapses modern civilization. This was written in 2014, by the way. At the center is a traveling Shakespeare troupe moving through the remnants of the world, performing these timeless pieces in a dismal landscape of survival. It's a post-apocalyptic story, but not one about zombies or action or brute perseverance. It's a story about memory and finding beauty where you can, and the unlikely ways that art can endure, and the strange persistence of culture even after everything dies away. And what really makes this book sing is Mandel's structure. She knits together these seemingly disparate plot lines and characters with an almost musical sense of rhythm. Information is doled out piece by precious piece, and connections snap into place so quietly and seamlessly that you won't notice if you're not paying close attention. At about the halfway mark, I had complete and utter trust in this author, and now I want to consume her entire catalog. And then on top of all that, there's the prose. I love the way this woman crafts sentences. It's clean, it's thoughtful, It's emotionally precise. It toes right up to the flowery line without crossing the threshold. And there is this, the best way I can describe it is there is this undercurrent of melancholy beneath every paragraph. And I felt it in my soul as I read and long after I finished it. But it's the kind of melancholy that still manages to carry a certain hopefulness along with it. I am obsessed with Emily St. John Mandel's work now. So why, you might be asking, isn't Station 11 in my top 10 of 2025? Well, to answer that question right now would be to spoil not one, but two later entries in my top 10 list. So hold your horses. The next runner-up I want to highlight is Love What Lasts by Joshua Gibbs. I had the good fortune of meeting Gibbs last year when he was the guest speaker at a professional development seminar at the school where I teach. And I was blown away by how easily he made some very heady concepts, not just understandable, but compelling. After he left, I did what any bookish person would do. I bought all of his books, and this is the one I started with. At its core, Love What Lasts is about learning how to properly order our loves, especially our love of art. Gibbs proposes a deceptively simple framework with which to do this. Art can be categorized as mediocre, common, or uncommon. Mediocre art is engineered to be consumed and forgotten. It flares brightly and then disappears like a disposable blockbuster. Common art is good, sometimes very good, and capable of lasting a lifetime. The music of Radiohead comes to mind, a band I've loved my whole life, but whose work isn't necessarily guaranteed to still be making waves 100 years from now. And then uncommon art is transcendent, the kind that endures for centuries, shaping cultures and souls. Think the works of Homer or Bach or Shakespeare. What I appreciated most about this book is that Gibbs never comes across as scolding or elitist. He's not saying you're a bad person for enjoying light or popular things. He is asking whether we are satisfied letting those things dominate our imaginations, and he warns that overconsumption of the mediocre actually corrupts our ability to appreciate the uncommon. As someone who thinks a lot about what we read and what we watch and what we hand to students, I found this book to be incredibly powerful. It didn't tell me what to love, but it helped me notice the difference between works that last and works that don't, and why that matters. This one didn't quite crack my top 10, but it definitely stuck with me in a way that I felt compelled to share with you all. And the final runner-up I want to talk about is The Dagger in Vichy by Alistair Reynolds. I haven't read nearly as much Reynolds as I would like to have, but everything I have read has left a lasting impression. I started with House of Suns, which absolutely blew my mind, and worked my way back to Revelation Space, and then hit Chasm City, which remains my favorite so far, a kind of Baroque noir-soaked fever dream that I still think about regularly. I did read Redemption Arc this past year, which I enjoyed and found to be a worthy sequel to Revelation Space, but I ended up placing it a little farther down on my list due to some glacial pacing and a somewhat saggy middle. The Dagger in Vichy is a short, sharp story that somehow manages to feel both intimate and sweeping at the same time. It's set in a far future where civilization has collapsed into something resembling medieval Europe, with only scattered remnants of advanced technology lingering at the edges. Like Station 11, the story follows a troupe of traveling thespians as they move from town to town. Though in Reynolds' story, they are performing plays attributed to an aging playwright named Master Guillaume, who believes his best work is now behind him. Our point of view comes through Rufus, a reformed horse thief whose life was saved and reshaped by Guillaume. They are also carrying a mysterious box, and as the story unfolds, the central question becomes unavoidable. What or who is in the box? When the answer finally arrives, it injects this wonderful tension into the story. It would be easy to frame this novella as being about the dangers of generative AI or about the role of art in human society. And those ideas certainly seem to be in there. But what I appreciated most is that Reynolds never turns this into a lecture. He gestures toward larger allegories without ever bogging down the story. First and foremost, this is a fast and clever and deeply enjoyable piece of science fiction. I will say it took me maybe 20 pages or so to fully settle in. Reynolds just throws you directly into the world and just trusts you to keep up. There's mention of something called the Wald, a slow-moving blight that may have played a role in civilization's collapse. And even by the end, I wasn't entirely sure I understood it. But honestly, that sense that the world is bigger than what's explained is part of what makes his writing so immersive. Once everything started to click, I couldn't put it down. This novella is tight and intriguing and surprisingly fun and just a little bit unsettling. It's Reynolds doing what he does best, conjuring entire worlds with just a few keystrokes and then making them feel genuinely lived in. For longtime fans of Reynolds, it's a very satisfying side dish along his larger novels. And for newcomers, it's a great sampler of what makes Reynolds special. The atmosphere, the mystery, and the feeling of deep history pressing in on practically every page. This one landed just outside the top 10, mostly because of its length. It's excellent, but my favorite books this year were the ones that had time to really get under my skin. And kicking off my top 10, at number 10 is Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson. And yes, after how justifiably hard I was on Rhythm of War, I want to be very clear. This book is pretty much the opposite of that experience. Words of Radiance continues the story of Roshar as Kaladin, Shallan, and Dalinar are drawn deeper into political intrigue and ancient mysteries, and an escalating supernatural conflict tied to the return of the Knights Radiant. Kaladin struggles with leadership and the weight of responsibility. Shallan's past begins to surface in unsettling ways as she navigates espionage and her own identity. And the larger world starts to reveal just how close it is to catastrophe. It's a book where the scope widens dramatically, but it never loses sight of its characters. What makes Words of Radiance really stand out is its balance. This book absolutely hits the ground running and barely lets up the entire time. It's thrilling and packed with some of the most exciting sequences Sanderson has ever written. And crucially, the quieter moments, the pauses, the conversations, the interior struggles, They feel earned. They're not bloat. They are breathing room. Without them, the book would honestly be overwhelming. Thematically, this is a book that is concerned with identity and brokenness and growth through pain. Kaladin's arc wrestles deeply with leadership and depression and the impossible burden of wanting to protect everyone. Shallan's story explores fractured identity and repression and the ways we use masks, sometimes literally, to survive trauma. Across the board, Words of Radiance is asking what it means to swear ideals when you are deeply flawed, and whether broken people can still become something better. And this is why the page count here works. Words of Radiance earns its girth, the emotional arcs, the revelations, the climactic payoffs. All of it, in my opinion, justifies the scale. I have very few criticisms of this book, and when I finished it, I felt energized rather than exhausted. Words of Radiance is what made me fall in love with the Stormlight Archive in the first place, even if Rhythm of War made me worry about the series overstaying its welcome. Coming in at number 9 is The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. A book I expected to appreciate academically, but didn't quite expect to love as much as I did. The novel follows Mary Lennox, a deeply unpleasant child who, following a cholera outbreak that kills her parents, is sent from colonial India to live with her reclusive uncle in a massive, gloomy estate on the Yorkshire moors. There, Mary stumbles upon a locked, neglected garden that has been left to decay after a family tragedy. As she slowly brings the garden back to life with the help of Dickon, a boy who is deeply attuned to nature, and Colin, a sickly and emotionally stunted cousin hidden away in the house, the act of restoration begins to transform all of them. What makes The Secret Garden so powerful is how directly it ties physical environment to inner life. At its core, this is a book about neglect, emotional, physical, spiritual neglect, and about how care, routine, beauty, and attention can reverse the effects of that neglect. Mary doesn't change because she's scolded into goodness. She changes because she's given responsibility and fresh air and work to do and meaningful relationships. The garden is itself a symbol and active agent of healing. Thematically, the novel is deeply invested in growth and discipline and the slow work of becoming human. There's a quiet insistence here that joy is something that is practiced and not just stumbled into. Colin's transformation in particular flirts with sentimentality, but ultimately avoids it by grounding his recovery in habit and belief and community rather than miracle. The book suggests somewhat radically that children are not these fragile little things, but resilient creatures who need purpose and challenge every bit as much as comfort. It's also a book that trusts patience. Nothing happens quickly. Redemption arrives gradually, almost imperceptibly, and that slowness feels very intentional. In a year where I read a lot of big, propulsive stories, The Secret Garden stood out precisely because of its restraint. It's not a perfect book, and it definitely carries some historical baggage that's worth acknowledging. But at its core, it's a beautiful meditation on renewal and attention and the healing power of tending something outside yourself. And that was more than enough to earn its number 9 spot. Coming in at number 8 is The Color of Magic by Terry Pratchett, my introduction to Discworld, and the very first Discworld novel in publication order. What a wildly strange and delightful place to start. The Color of Magic follows Rincewind, a wizard spectacularly unsuited to wizarding, who would very much like to survive long enough to avoid doing anything heroic. Unfortunately for him, he is tasked with guiding Twoflower, Discworld's first tourist, across a flat world carried through space on the backs of 4 elephants standing atop a giant turtle. What follows is a loosely connected series of misadventures involving dragons and gods who treat reality like a board game, and barbarian heroes, and cities that are always just one poor decision away from utter catastrophe. What makes this book work isn't plot at all. It's the voice. The Color of Magic is openly episodic, almost sketch-like, and it's clearly riffing on classic fantasy tropes. Sword and sorcery heroes, prophecies, ancient magic, and it's gleefully poking holes in all of them. Pratchett isn't trying to build a grand myth yet. He is dismantling one, brick by brick, with jokes. Thematically, the book is already doing something very Pratchett-y, interrogating narrative inevitability. Heroes survive because they're heroes. Wizards are wise because stories say that they are. Fate works because everyone just agrees to play along. The Color of Magic keeps asking what happens when someone refuses to cooperate with the story, when a coward is forced into the role of protagonist, or when curiosity proves more dangerous than malice. It's also a book about systems, economic systems, religious systems, magic systems, and how absurd they all become when taken too seriously for too long. The gods are petty, the institutions are self-serving, and the universe itself feels like it's held together by narrative duct tape. And yet, underneath the satire, there is a genuine affection for people muddling through a chaotic world with whatever tools they have at their disposal. Is it the most polished Discworld novel? Definitely not. You can feel Pratchett still figuring things out. But as a first step into the universe, it's fun and funny and surprisingly sharp, with a few moments that genuinely blew my mind. It made me want to keep going immediately, which is exactly what an introduction should do. Coming in at number 7 is My Struggle, Book 4 by Carroll Knausgaard, the 4th volume in his critically hailed series. Book 4 shifts focus to Knausgaard's early adulthood, particularly his years as a teacher in northern Norway. Much of this book centers on his daily routines, his anxieties, his romantic missteps, and his growing obsession with writing and the fear that he may never become the person he imagines himself to be. As with the rest of My Struggle, the plot is minimal. The real movement happens internally through memory and rumination and relentless self-examination. It's also worth noting that this is definitely the horniest volume of the series so far. Sexual desire and fantasy and frustration and embarrassment, these are all right on the surface here, and Knausgaard doesn't soften or aestheticize any of it. It's awkward and compulsive and often very uncomfortable, and entirely consistent with the book's larger commitment to refusing polish or self-protection. What makes this volume stand out within the series is how sharply it captures the terror of becoming oneself. This is a book about standing on the threshold of adulthood and feeling utterly unprepared to cross it. Knausgaard is obsessed with questions of authenticity, what it means to live truthfully, to write honestly, and to reconcile the version of yourself that you present to the world with the one you experience privately. His fixation on these ideas can be exhausting, honestly. But it's also sort of the point. Thematically, Book 4 is deeply concerned with time and shame and desire and the formation of identity. Like the rest of the series, these small moments, awkward classroom interactions, fleeting relationships, banal domestic scenes, they're all treated with the same seriousness as major life events. Knausgaard insists that meaning isn't found in highlights, but in accumulation, in the way days stack up and quietly shape who we become. This is probably not a book for everyone. It's long, it's repetitive, it is admittedly self-absorbed, and it's often fairly uncomfortable. But when it works, it produces an almost unnerving sense of recognition. Few writers are as willing as Knausgaard to sit with the embarrassing and the petty and the unresolved without trying to redeem them. I didn't love every moment of this volume, and there were stretches that admittedly tested my patience. But my struggle, Book 4, earns its place here for the sheer intensity of its honesty and for how uncompromising it is in its attempt to record a life as it is actually lived and not as it's meant to be remembered. Coming in at number 6 is Solarium by Braden Matthew, a book from indie Slovenian publisher Corona Samizdat. And this was one of the biggest surprises of my reading year. Not just in the plot twist sense, though it absolutely has a handful of those, but surprising in how much the book manages to accomplish without collapsing under its own ambition. Solarium centers on Bib, a deeply flawed bibliophile in a world where reading has largely been eclipsed by something called the human theater, a strange, immersive form of entertainment that has become humanity's dominant cultural outlet. The human theater is technically the novel's primary sci-fi conceit, but what's fascinating is how often the book just lets it recede into the background. Instead, we follow Bib as he self-sabotages and avoids responsibility and circles moments of clarity and then retreats back into old patterns. This speculative element sort of vibrates beneath the surface, and it shapes the world without constantly announcing itself. What makes Solarium work and what genuinely impressed me is the fusion of formal experimentation with emotional realism. This is a book where reality itself sometimes feels negotiable, where language and meaning slide under your feet, and yet the emotional beats land with startling precision. Bib's flaws are the gravitational center of the novel. His obsession with books, his evasions, his failures, all of it feels painfully human, even as the narrative structure grows increasingly labyrinthine. Thematically, Solarium is deeply invested in attention and avoidance, and the stories we tell ourselves to justify stagnation. It's about what happens when intellectual obsession becomes a shield against actually living, and how easily insight can coexist with paralysis. The novel keeps asking whether self-knowledge actually leads to change, or whether it can become just another sophisticated way to stay exactly where you are. There's also a light, ergodic touch here, the occasional lengthy footnote, the sense that the book is something that you navigate as much as you read. It never tips fully into House of Leaves territory, but it adds just enough friction to make the act of reading feel participatory. What ultimately elevates Solarium, though, is its payoff. It's one thing to write a clever, conceptually ambitious book. It's another to make that ambition feel inhabited. This novel delivers several revelations that reframe not only the plot, but the people, moments that force you to reconsider characters the way you would reconsider a real friend after realizing you've misunderstood them for years. Solarium is disorienting in the best way. It's challenging but compulsively readable. It's experimental but deeply humane. It left me chasing that feeling afterward, which is usually how I know a book has earned its place on a list like this. Coming in at number 5 is The Glass Hotel by Emily St. John Mandel, a novel that feels deceptively quiet while doing an enormous amount of work under the surface. The Glass Hotel revolves around a massive financial fraud and the long shadow it casts over a constellation of characters connected to it. At the center are Vincent, a bartender who becomes entangled with a charismatic financier running a Ponzi scheme, and her half-brother Paul, a drifting figure whose life unfolds in parallel, often at a distance. The story moves across time and geography, from luxury hotels to shipping containers, from moments of intimacy to moments of despair, tracing how a single act of deception ripples outward, reshaping lives in subtle and not so subtle ways. What Mandel does better than almost anyone is make systems feel personal. This is a novel about money and fraud and global capital, but it's never interested in the mechanics for their own sake. Instead, it's about how these abstract systems distort identity and memory and moral responsibility. The financial crime at the heart of the book is less important than the emotional debris it leaves behind. The quiet guilt, the displaced anger, the sense that something foundational has been cracked and can never quite be repaired. Thematically, The Glass Hotel is obsessed with ghosts, the haunting presence of alternate lives, missed choices, moral debts. In fact, at its heart, I think The Glass Hotel is a ghost story. Characters are constantly imagining who they might have been if one small decision had gone differently. Mandel returns again and again to the idea that we are followed by the versions of ourselves we didn't become, and that living with that knowledge is terrifying and sorrowful and just part of adulthood. There's also, like Station 11, a deep melancholy here, but it's a bit more restrained. Mandel's prose is precise and cool and controlled, and it allows the emotional weight to accumulate gradually rather than announcing itself overtly. By the time the novel reaches its quiet conclusions, you realize how thoroughly it's settled into you. The Glass Hotel isn't showy. It doesn't rely on big climaxes or dramatic reversals. Instead, it earns its place here through atmosphere and cohesion and a lingering emotional afterimage. The kind of book that keeps resurfacing in your thoughts long after you've finished it. Coming in at number 4 is Equal Rights by Terry Pratchett. the third Discworld novel and my favorite Discworld book so far. This is the one where everything really clicked for me. Equal Rights follows Escarina, a young girl accidentally given the powers and expectations of a wizard in a world where wizardry is an exclusively male profession. Raised by Granny Weatherwax, one of Discworld's most formidable witches, Escarina is sent to Unseen University to learn magic, where her very existence quietly threatens centuries of tradition and deeply ingrained assumptions about who power is for. What follows is less a conventional quest and more a slow, pointed confrontation between lived reality and rigid systems. What elevates Equal Rights is how confidently Pratchett mixes character comedy with institutional critique. Escarina is sharp and curious and stubborn in exactly the right ways. But the real gravitational force of the novel is Granny Weatherwax. She's pragmatic and intimidating and fiercely intelligent. Granny's brand of magic isn't flashy. It's about understanding people and systems well enough to bend them without announcing that you're doing so. She's already one of Pratchett's great creations here, long before later books apparently deepen her legend. Thematically, Equal Rights is about who gets access to power and why. Pratchett skewers tradition for tradition's sake, not by shouting about injustice, but by calmly exposing how arbitrary and fragile these rules really are. The book asks whether institutions exist to cultivate wisdom or merely to preserve themselves, and whether genuine change requires overthrow or simply refusing to cooperate with nonsense. What I love most is how humane the book is. It's funny, sure, often very funny, but it's never cruel. Even the satire comes with empathy. Pratchett understands that systems don't persist because people are evil, but because they're comfortable or afraid, or often just unimaginative. Equal Rights critiques that reality by imagining a gentler, smarter alternative. This was the Discworld novel where I stopped thinking of the series as clever parody and started seeing it as something much richer. This place where humor is a delivery system for genuinely serious ideas. Between Escarina and Granny Weatherwax, this book absolutely earned its place near the top of my list. Coming in at number 3 is The Crow Road by Iain Banks, a novel that feels both intensely personal and quietly monumental. The story follows Prentice McCohen as he returns to his sprawling, eccentric Scottish family and becomes entangled in the mystery of his missing uncle Rory, a brilliant, erratic figure whose disappearance hangs over the narrative like a dark cloud. As Prentice reconstructs Rory's life, the novel moves fluidly through memory and family history and grief and revelation, gradually exposing secrets that have shaped and misshaped multiple generations. What makes The Crow Road so powerful is its command of voice and memory. Banks writes with a rare confidence, shifting between humor and intimacy and menace without ever losing control. The book opens with one of the greatest first lines in modern literature, and it never quite lets you forget that death, sudden, arbitrary, often absurd, is always nearby. But the novel's never dour. It's funny and warm and frequently life-affirming, even as it stares directly at mortality. Thematically, The Crow Road is deeply concerned with family and inheritance, and the stories we tell to survive loss. Banks is fascinated by how families mythologize themselves, how anecdotes harden into legends, and how silence becomes its own form of storytelling, and how understanding the past can be both liberating and devastating. Prentice's investigation into Rory's fate becomes a broader reckoning with adulthood, the moment when inherited narratives stop being sufficient and you're forced to decide what you actually believe. There's also a strong undercurrent of intellectual curiosity here: science, philosophy, skepticism. Banks never treats intelligence as ornamental. Ideas matter because they shape how characters live and how they love and how they justify their choices. And the novel trusts the reader to keep up, to sit with the ambiguity, and to accept that not every answer comes neatly packaged. By the time The Crow Road reaches its conclusion, the emotional impact feels earned rather than engineered. It's a book that leaves you changed in very quiet ways. It makes you reconsider the weight of memory and the fragility of certainty and the strange, stubborn beauty of just being alive. Coming in at number 2 is Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel, a book that absolutely blew my mind. I could not put this book down. I devoured it in 2 days, and when I finished, I just sat there for a bit, stunned. Sea of Tranquility follows multiple characters across centuries, from an exiled aristocrat in 1912 to a writer on a book tour during a pandemic to a detective living in a far future moon colony. These timelines are connected by a strange anomaly, a moment that shouldn't exist, a glitch in reality, and by a growing sense that time itself may be less stable than we like to believe. As the novel unfolds, Mandel weaves these threads together into a story about art and memory and simulation and the lingering echoes of human lives. What makes this book so extraordinary is how effortlessly it mixes literary intimacy with speculative ambition. Mandel takes big, heady sci-fi ideas, time loops, simulated realities, causality, and she grounds them in deeply human concerns: loneliness, regret, creative doubt, the quiet desire for meaning. The speculative elements never overwhelm the characters. Instead, they sharpen them, giving emotional weight to ideas that could have easily become abstract. Thematically, Sea of Tranquility is obsessed with connection across time, how art outlives its creators, how moments echo forward, and how people who will never meet can still shape one another's lives. There's also a strong meditation here on pandemics and isolation and the fragile infrastructure of normalcy. But Mandel handles this with remarkable restraint. Nothing feels exploitative or sensational. It's reflective, it's compassionate, it's quietly devastating. What really sets this book apart is its confidence. It trusts the reader. It moves quickly, but never sloppily. Every section feels purposeful. Every shift in perspective feels earned. By the time the novel begins to reveal what's really going on, the sense of awe is matched by a deep emotional resonance. This was one of those rare reading experiences where momentum and meaning perfectly aligned, where I was flying through pages not just because I needed to know what happened next, but because I cared so deeply about why it mattered. If not for one book that edged it out just a little bit, this very easily could have been my number one of last year. But my number one book of 2025 is Underworld by Don DeLillo. This is a monumental novel, one that doesn't tell a story so much as construct an entire psychic ecosystem and then invite you to wander through it. Underworld is dark and funny and sprawling and grimy and relentlessly eye-opening. It feels less like a conventional narrative and more like a work of cultural archaeology, excavating the buried layers of post-war America with obsessive care. And this feeling is further solidified by the book's unique structure. Underworld moves backwards in time through the latter half of the 20th century, loosely orbiting around the character Nick Shea and a litany of interconnected lives. Along the way, DeLillo stitches together baseball and nuclear anxiety and waste management and art and stand-up comedy and terrorism and memory and obsession into a single astonishing tome. The book famously opens with a historic baseball game and then peels back time, not to retreat into nostalgia, but to reveal how the present is built atop decades of fear and desire and discarded history. What's extraordinary is how cohesive this all feels. DeLillo can make a landfill feel metaphysical. He can turn a baseball into a relic of national mythology. He understands that America's obsessions with spectacle, with violence, with consumption, with control, they're all expressions of the same underlying anxiety. Few writers could juggle this many ideas without collapsing into chaos, but DeLillo doesn't just juggle them, he orchestrates them like a master conductor. Thematically, Underworld is about waste and memory and the longing for coherence. What do we discard and what refuses to stay buried? How do private lives intersect with public catastrophe? How does a culture metabolize fear, especially the fear of annihilation, and turn it into entertainment and ritual and myth? DeLillo sees America with this brutal clarity, capturing both its manic energy and its pervasive dread. What struck me most, though, was the texture of the book. Underworld is crowded with voices and ideas. It's often very funny, sharply, incisively so, but that humor always cuts against a deeper unease. There's a constant sense that meaning is just barely holding together, that everything is on the verge of slipping out of focus. Reading it feels like being immersed in the noise of history itself. This is not a novel that you get in one pass. A second reading feels less like an option and more like a full-on requirement, if only to trace the dense web of connections that are found all across its pages. But even on a first read, the power of the book is undeniable. You feel constantly that you are in the hands of a writer operating at the absolute peak of his abilities. And it is because of all this that Underworld demanded the top spot. Looking back at this list, what really strikes me is how consistent these books are, even across wildly different genres. These are books that reward attention, books that trust the reader, books that are willing to be challenging or patient or strange or uncomfortable in pursuit of something honest. Whether it's DeLillo, excavating the psychic debris of post-war America, or Emily St. John Mandel folding time and memory into something upsettingly human, or Pratchett smuggling serious moral questions inside of jokes, or Knausgaard refusing to look away from the embarrassing textures of life. These are slowly formative stories that stay with you not because they're comfortable, but because they've altered the way you see the world. And I think that's what I'm ultimately chasing as a reader. Not comfort, not consensus, not even pleasure in the narrow sense, but books that change the way I see the world. Books that linger, books that feel bigger on a reread than they did the first time through. If there's a unifying thread here, it's that all of these novels believe that reading still matters, that language and memory and imagination, they're not simply pastimes, but tools for understanding who we are and how we got here. And that, for me, is reason enough to keep reading. Thank you for watching.